The fall of a mighty leader. In the vast expanse of the universe, where power and influence could shift in the blink of an eye, a once great alien leader found herself bound by the chains of an unforgiving fate. The woman known as Kayla had been a symbol of strength, wisdom, and the unyielding spirit of her people, the Zyrakians. They were a race known for their intelligence, prowess in battle, and spiritual connection to the stars. Kayla had led her people with grace, commanding respect from both her allies and enemies. Yet, all of that came crashing down when a tragic misunderstanding led to the death of an influential galactic official. The intergalactic court, indifferent to the nuances of the situation, condemned her to a fate worse than death, slavery. Her punishment was severe. Stripped of her title, her dignity, and her freedom, Kayla was handed over to a human, an ordinary man by all accounts. His name was Cullum, a mechanic from a small human colony on the edge of the galaxy. To her captors, the decision was simple. She would serve as his slave, the perfect symbol of the Zyrakian race's humiliation. Thrown into the dim confines of a sterile, metallic cell aboard a gargantuan starship, Kayla's heart burned with rage and sorrow. But even in this despair, a flicker of hope remained. She refused to accept this fate. The warrior inside her had not died. It was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The unlikely bond. When Kayla first arrived on the starship, she expected harsh treatment, degradation, and the coldness of her captors. The fate she had been sentenced to was one she could hardly comprehend. Being condemned to serve a human, a species she had long regarded with a mix of indifference and disdain, was humiliating, especially after all she had sacrificed for her people. But Callum was different. At first, he wasn't the cruel, power-hungry man she had anticipated. Instead, he was kind, seemingly embarrassed by the whole situation. His awkwardness around her in the beginning was almost endearing. His first words to her were nothing more than a stilted attempt to offer some food, which Kayla barely glanced at, too proud to accept the offering. He didn't press her, though. There was something genuine about him, a stark contrast to the smugness of his colleagues, who often looked at Kayla as nothing more than a prisoner to be controlled. Callum didn't share that same detachment. He seemed uncertain, unsure of how to interact with someone like her, a woman whose mere presence had once struck fear into the hearts of entire armies. To Kayla, this made him something of an enigma. Days passed, and Callum continued to behave in ways she hadn't expected. He didn't speak much about her crimes, and he never referred to her as a slave. Instead, he would ask her questions, seemingly curious about the Zyrakians and their ways. "What do your people believe about the stars?" he had once asked, catching her off guard. Kayla, in turn, began to watch him more closely. She had spent her life leading her people, commanding respect through strength and wisdom. But here was this man, this simple mechanic, who seemed to hold no malice toward her, no desire to see her broken. At times, she could almost convince herself that he pitied her, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something more complex. He was not a man to be underestimated, not in the way the others were. One night, as she sat on the cold metal floor of her cell, Kayla heard the sound of footsteps echoing outside. She looked up to see Callum standing in the doorway, holding something in his hands. It was a book, worn and dog-eared, its pages yellowed with age. "I found this," he said awkwardly, offering it to her. "It's a collection of poems. I thought you might like it." Kayla stared at the book, unsure what to make of it. She had never seen a human so thoughtful before. Hesitantly, she took it from him, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. It was a fleeting contact, but for Kayla, it was enough to feel a strange connection. The weight of the book in her hands seemed symbolic. It wasn't much, but it was something he had given her out of his own volition, not out of obligation. As she began reading the poems, Kayla found herself drawn into a world she had never imagined. The words were simple, yet there was a depth to them that stirred something inside her. It wasn't the grand strategy of war or the fierce, combative nature of her people that Callum seemed to understand, it was the quiet, delicate things. The small, unnoticed moments of life that she had once taken for granted. She had not realized until that moment how much she had longed for a sense of peace. The Zyrakians were a race born out of necessity, their strength forged in battle and their unity born from the harsh realities of survival. But Callum, through something as simple as a book of poems, had reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten, the beauty of life outside of conflict. Their interactions became more frequent. Every day, Callum would bring something new, small trinkets from the ship's supplies, words of encouragement, or even a simple joke to lighten the oppressive atmosphere that hung over her cell. Kayla found herself looking forward to these small moments, even if she didn't show it. She had learned to mask her emotions, to hide her true thoughts behind a wall of coldness and pride. Yet, deep down, she could not deny the growing sense of connection she felt toward him. One evening, after a particularly difficult day where Kayla had been forced to endure more humiliations at the hands of the ship's guards, she collapsed onto her bed in exhaustion. Callum appeared at her door once again, this time holding a small tray of food. He didn't say anything, just placed the tray on the floor beside her and sat down on the edge of the cell, keeping his distance but offering his presence. "I don't know how you do it," he said softly, breaking the silence. "You've been through so much, and yet, you're still standing." Kayla looked at him, her gaze piercing through the shadows of the room. There was something in his voice that made her pause. It wasn't pity, nor was it condescension, it was admiration. She had expected nothing less than scorn from her captors, but here was Callum, speaking to her as if she were a person deserving of respect. "I've had no choice," she replied, her voice steady. "I've been broken before. But that doesn't mean I stay down." For the first time, Kayla noticed the way his eyes softened. He didn't respond immediately, as if the weight of her words had struck him deeply. But when he did speak again, his voice was quieter, more introspective. Maybe it's not about how many times you get knocked down. Maybe it's about how many times you choose to get back up." Those words lingered in her mind long after he left. They were simple, but there was a truth to them that resonated with her on a level she hadn't expected. Callum, this man who had once seemed so ordinary, had just given her a piece of wisdom that cut through the layers of armor she had built around herself. Kayla began to realize that, perhaps, this bond between them wasn't one of master and slave, or even captor and prisoner. Perhaps it was something more, something she had never allowed herself to consider. In Callum, she saw not only a chance for survival, but the possibility of something that could transcend the brutality of her circumstances, friendship. And as their relationship deepened, Kayla found herself torn. She had never trusted humans before, had always viewed them as weak and easily manipulated. But Callum had shown her another side of them, a side that wasn't bound by power or politics. For the first time in her life, Kayla questioned the beliefs she had held onto so tightly. She began to wonder if there was more to life than conquest and war. Could there be a future for her outside of the rigid expectations that had once defined her existence? With each passing day, Kayla realized that the walls of her cell were not just made of metal. They were made of her own doubts and fears. And it was Callum, with his quiet strength and unwavering kindness, who had begun to dismantle them piece by piece. In him, she found something she hadn't even known she was searching for, hope, the plan for freedom. Kayla's situation had changed, but not in the way she had hoped. Her days were still filled with chains, silent guards, and the looming presence of an ever-watchful ship's surveillance system. But as the weeks passed, the steady rhythm of captivity began to change in subtle ways. Callum's kindness, at first a fleeting distraction, had grown into something more tangible. His visits, once brief and awkward, were now a source of genuine comfort. Yet, Kayla knew her time was running out. As much as she wished to savor the solace his company offered, her mind remained sharp, always calculating, always looking for the cracks in her captivity. She had spent countless hours studying the layout of the ship, the movements of its inhabitants, and the quirks of the technology that surrounded her. For Kayla, every detail mattered. The angles of the walls, the ventilation shafts, the location of the security cameras, these would be her tools, her weapons in the fight for freedom. But it wasn't just about escape. It was about something deeper, reclaiming her dignity, her autonomy, and ultimately, her future. Her nights were often sleepless, filled with plans and scenarios running through her mind. She knew there was no room for error. Her escape had to be meticulous, and she had to make it happen before the patrols began to notice her absences or start looking for a way to punish her further. She could no longer afford to be passive. It was time to act. Callum had been a silent ally in these plans, even though he didn't fully understand the extent of what Kayla was plotting. She had never told him the full truth of her captivity, she hadn't shared the heavy burden of what it meant to be a Zerakian leader forced into servitude. But in small, almost imperceptible ways, Kayla allowed Callum to assist her in her schemes. He had already shown himself to be trustworthy, and it was clear that his loyalty ran deep. But Kayla was careful. She had learned to trust only herself, and her people had never relied on anyone but their own kind to survive. One evening, Kayla sat in the sterile confines of her small, cold cell, her thoughts sharper than ever. Callum had left a few moments ago, offering her a brief but understanding look as he'd closed the door. His expression had been unreadable, though she suspected he might have known more than he let on. His support, while seemingly simple, offering her food or distraction, had taken on new meaning in her mind. He was not only the key to her survival in this hostile environment, he might be her only true ally. Kayla knew that to escape, she would need to exploit the ship's weaknesses. The ship was a marvel of technology, a gleaming example of human ingenuity, but even the most sophisticated machines had flaws. Security systems could be hacked, codes could be bypassed, and metal walls could be broken through. It was all a matter of knowing where to strike, and that was what Kayla excelled at. She had spent years navigating the political mazes of her homeworld, and though the stakes were far higher now, the principles of strategy had not changed. She would outthink her captors, slip through their defenses, and emerge victorious, no matter the cost. Her first step was to test the ship's surveillance. She knew the cameras were omnipresent, but Callum's small acts of defiance had given her insight into how to avoid detection. Each day, she would linger in the corners of the hallways, pretending to be lost in thought or distracted by a task. With every passing moment, she memorized the camera angles, the intervals between each sweep of the guards, and the gaps in their vigilance. But there was something else, something Kayla hadn't anticipated. The ship's security system wasn't just physical, it was highly digital. She'd seen the terminals, the glowing screens that lined the ship's corridors, where information was constantly being fed back to the control center. If she could find a way to tap into this system, she might have a chance to disable the surveillance temporarily, even if it were only for a few minutes. It was a risk, but it was the only shot she had. One night, as Kayla sat in her cell, she noticed something. Callum had slipped a small, inconspicuous tool into her hand when he had brought her food, a small data pad, no bigger than her palm. At first, she thought it might be some kind of trick, a way to catch her attempting to escape. But then she realized it was something far more useful. The device appeared to be a basic hacking tool, one that Callum had apparently obtained from somewhere on the ship. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Kayla's fingers tingled as she activated it, feeling the surge of power as the screen lit up with information. She couldn't risk using it in her cell. The walls were too thin, the guards too close. But during the next patrol, when the ship's crew was distracted by an impending emergency drill, Kayla made her move. She snuck into the darkened corridor where the terminal was located, hidden from the prying eyes of the crew. The small datapad, though not designed for the kind of heavy-duty hacking Kayla was attempting, worked like a charm. She quickly tapped in the code she had memorized and watched as the terminal flickered and died, its control lights dimming to an almost imperceptible level. For the next 5 minutes, she had full access to the ship's network. But it wasn't just about hacking the cameras. Kayla knew that she had to disable other systems, communications, the automated defenses, anything that might stand between her and her escape. Every click, every keystroke brought her closer to her goal. And with each success, she felt a rising sense of empowerment that hadn't been with her since her fall from grace. She could hear the distant sounds of footsteps echoing in the hallway, and Kayla's heart raced. It was time to leave. But just as she was about to pull the data pad from the terminal, a soft sound behind her made her freeze. She turned slowly, expecting to see a guard, but it was only Callum. He was standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with concern. "Kayla, what are you doing?" For a moment, she simply stared at him. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I'm leaving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Callum stepped into the room, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Kayla, if you do this, you won't be able to come back. You can't just leave. Not like this." Kayla felt her heart sink. "You don't understand, Callum. I can't stay here. I'm a prisoner. I'm nothing but a pawn in their game. If I don't do this now, I'll never get another chance." Callum looked torn, his brow furrowed with concern. "But you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you." Kayla paused, her mind racing. She had never trusted anyone this way, never let anyone close enough to see her vulnerabilities. But Callum's offer was sincere, his voice full of emotion. And in that moment, Kayla realized that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. "All right," she said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like forever. "But you have to follow my lead." The breakthrough. Kayla's decision to allow Callum into her plans marked a new chapter in her struggle for freedom. Trust was something that had been hard for her to embrace, especially after the betrayal she had experienced from her own people. But as she stared into Callum's earnest eyes, something shifted within her. He wasn't just some ship's officer anymore, he was an ally. And Kayla had learned long ago that allies, no matter their origin, could be the difference between victory and defeat. The days that followed were a blur of activity, as Kayla and Callum worked in tandem, weaving their efforts into the ship's very framework. Kayla would spend hours in her cell, pretending to be a docile, submissive prisoner while Callum worked in the shadows, slipping in and out of restricted areas to gather crucial information and supplies. There were times when Kayla doubted herself, moments when the weight of their plan seemed almost impossible to bear. But Callum's presence reminded her of her own strength, the fierce resilience that still thrummed beneath her skin. Their first major breakthrough came when Kayla successfully decrypted a security code embedded in the ship's operating system. It was a minor victory, one that barely seemed to register on the ship's radar. But for Kayla, it was the spark she needed. The code she cracked allowed her to temporarily disable the surveillance cameras in her immediate vicinity, buying her precious minutes. It was a small step, but it was a step towards something larger, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could escape. That night, Kayla worked relentlessly, copying over encrypted files from the ship's mainframe. With each file she unlocked, she learned more about the ship's systems, its vulnerabilities, and its hidden secrets. What she discovered sent a shiver down her spine. There was a narrow window of opportunity coming up in less than a week, a time when the ship's systems would undergo routine maintenance. It was the perfect moment to strike. The plan was simple, but it required precision. Kayla and Callum would infiltrate the ship's command center, access the main control panel, and override the security measures. During this window, the ship's crew would be busy with system checks, and the guards would be distracted, giving them the chance to slip past undetected. But there was one crucial element that Kayla knew they would need: humanity's ingenuity. In the midst of all the high-tech defenses and alien architecture, Kayla realized that the one thing humans had that could make the difference was their resourcefulness. Callum was the embodiment of that ingenuity. He had an instinct for tinkering, for understanding the systems that made the ship function. The more time they spent together, the more Kayla saw the depth of his talents. He wasn't just a soldier or a low-ranking officer, he was a genius when it came to technology. His mind was sharp, and his ability to think on his feet made him an invaluable asset to their mission. As the week passed, Kayla and Callum worked tirelessly, fine-tuning their strategy. They gathered supplies, tools, gadgets, anything that could be used to disable the ship's security systems or create distractions. They studied the ship's layout, memorizing the locations of key terminals, control rooms, and the guards' patrol routes. Every night, Kayla would go over the plan in her mind, rehearsing each movement, each contingency. The closer they got to the day of their escape, the more intense the pressure became. Kayla could feel the weight of their mission pressing on her shoulders, and it was at times almost unbearable. But there was something in her that refused to quit, something deep within her that kept her moving forward. She had lived through the fall of her people, had witnessed the destruction of everything she had known. She would not let her story end here, not as a slave, not as a symbol of defeat. The day of the maintenance window arrived, and Kayla's heart raced with anticipation. The ship's crew was distracted by the routine checks and diagnostics, leaving the corridors quieter than usual. It was a moment of rare calm, one that they could not afford to waste. Kayla and Callum moved through the ship's lower levels, careful to avoid detection. The corridors were dim, the hum of the ship's engines echoing around them. Each step they took brought them closer to the heart of the ship, closer to freedom. But the plan wasn't without its risks. As Kayla and Callum approached the command center, they encountered their first major obstacle, a locked door leading to the heart of the ship's control systems. It was a thick, reinforced door that had no visible access panel. Kayla had known the ship's layout inside and out, but this particular door had always been a mystery. There had been no way to bypass it using the usual methods. Callum, however, wasn't deterred. He knelt down before the door, pulling out a small device from his pack, a makeshift tool of his own design. It was a small, portable electromagnetic pulse generator, something that would temporarily disable the door's locking mechanism. Kayla held her breath as he worked, watching as his fingers moved with practiced ease. The seconds felt like hours, but finally, with a soft click, the door's lock disengaged. The two of them exchanged a brief, victorious look before slipping through the door and into the command center. The room was bathed in the soft glow of control panels, terminals blinking with data. It was everything Kayla had dreamed of, and yet it felt surreal. They were here, at the heart of the ship's power. Now, they just had to find a way to take control. Kayla moved toward the main terminal, her fingers trembling with excitement as she connected the datapad Callum had given her to the central console. A series of commands appeared on the screen, and Kayla began typing furiously, bypassing security protocols and overriding the ship's central command system. It was a delicate process, one that required not just skill, but complete focus. Every keystroke could be their undoing, but Kayla had no intention of failing now. As she worked, Callum kept watch, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. They knew they didn't have long before someone would notice their absence. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a brief moment, Kayla allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to step off this ship and into the unknown, to reclaim her life, her freedom. With a final, triumphant click, Kayla successfully shut down the ship's security systems. The room fell silent, and Kayla allowed herself a small smile of relief. It was done. But now came the hardest part, getting off the ship. The great escape. The moment the security systems were disabled, a surge of adrenaline coursed through Kayla's veins. Her breath quickened, and her mind raced. She knew they were on borrowed time, every second counted. The command center was their lifeline, the key to breaking free from the vessel that had been their prison for so long. But now, with the systems down, they had a real chance to escape. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Kayla's fingers hovered over the keypad for just a moment longer, ensuring that the breach had been fully executed. The terminal's display blinked a final confirmation: everything was in order. The ship's cameras and motion detectors were now offline, its security networks compromised. They could move through the corridors without fear of being detected. But Kayla knew that this wasn't enough. They had to get to the hangar and board one of the escape pods before anyone noticed they were gone. She quickly moved toward the exit, nodding to Callum. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice steady but urgent. Callum nodded, and they both slipped through the command center's door, into the dimly lit hallway. The ship was vast, too vast for two people to navigate unnoticed for long, but they had the element of surprise on their side. Their movements were swift and calculated, each step bringing them closer to their goal. Kayla's heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve remained unshaken. She could do this. She would do this. As they neared the nearest stairwell that would lead them down to the hangar level, Kayla's mind replayed the events that had brought them here. She remembered the first time she'd felt the sting of betrayal when her people had turned on her. The moment when she was handed over to the intergalactic court, sentenced to be a slave to a human, a species she had once believed inferior. That sense of helplessness had been almost unbearable. But it was in that moment that she discovered something crucial about herself: the strength to endure, to survive against all odds. It was a strength that had grown as she did, a quiet fire that had never burned out. Now, in the belly of this massive starship, she was faced with a new challenge: freedom. It seemed like a distant dream, something so far beyond her grasp that it could only exist in her imagination. Yet, here she was, at the threshold of possibility, with a human by her side who had believed in her when no one else did. Callum had risked everything for her: his position, his life, his future. Kayla didn't fully understand why he had chosen to help her, but there was something in his eyes, something deep within him that made her believe it wasn't just for some higher cause. It was because he wanted to help her, because he saw her as more than just a prisoner or a symbol of defeat. He saw her as a person, as someone worth saving. Kayla took a deep breath as they reached the stairwell. Callum gave her a quick glance before descending the stairs first, his hand on the railing as he moved silently, careful not to make a sound. Kayla followed closely behind, her movements graceful and fluid, a stark contrast to the imposing weight of the ship's structure around them. They reached the lower levels without encountering any resistance. It seemed that the maintenance window was working in their favor. But the real test was just ahead: the hangar. The hangar was located deep in the heart of the ship, a massive cavern where the escape pods and other vessels were stored. It was heavily guarded, and while the security systems were down, Kayla and Callum both knew that the guards would soon notice the breach. They would be hunting for them. Every moment they spent moving toward the hangar was another moment closer to being discovered. When they finally reached the hangar bay doors, Kayla's heart skipped a beat. The enormous doors were sealed tight, and the security panel beside them blinked in a rhythmic pattern. It was clear that there was still some level of security in place, even if the cameras and motion sensors were down. Kayla glanced at Callum, who was already assessing the panel. There was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to wait for an opportunity to present itself, they had to take control of the situation now. Callum immediately set to work, his hands moving quickly as he hacked into the control panel. Kayla kept watch, her gaze scanning the dark, empty expanse of the hangar. There were ships docked here, massive vessels with sleek hulls and alien technology, but they weren't what they needed. The escape pods were tucked away in a separate section of the hangar, protected by thick barriers. If they could just get through these doors, they would be able to access them. Kayla's mind raced with possibilities. What if they didn't make it? What if the alarm sounded just as they reached the pods? What if? A soft beep interrupted her thoughts. Callum had unlocked the panel. "Done," he whispered, looking up at her with a mix of relief and determination. "We've got 5 minutes before the backup systems kick in." Kayla nodded. "Then let's move." They sprinted toward the escape pod bay, where rows of small, sleek ships waited. Their path was lit only by emergency lighting, casting long shadows on the cold metal floor. The hangar felt eerily silent, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they reached the pods, Kayla's heart soared. She could already see the pod they would use, a small, agile ship designed for quick evacuations. But just as she and Callum moved toward it, a harsh voice broke the silence. "Stop right there." Kayla's blood ran cold. They had been spotted. The sound of heavy boots echoed behind them as several armed guards appeared in the entrance. The moment of truth had come. "Move fast," Kayla hissed to Callum. Without hesitation, Callum sprinted toward the pod, pulling out a small device from his belt. It was a thermal grenade, something he had made himself. He tossed it toward the guards, and as it exploded, a burst of smoke and heat filled the hangar. Kayla could hear the guards scrambling to cover their faces, but there was no time to waste. They leapt into the pod and sealed the hatch. Kayla's hands flew over the controls, her eyes scanning the readouts. The countdown to launch began, but the guards were already recovering. They would stop at nothing to catch them. Kayla glanced at Callum one last time. "Ready?" Callum gave her a grim smile. "Born ready." The pod's engines roared to life as Kayla punched in the launch sequence. The ship shot forward, and with a deafening roar, it blasted out of the hangar and into the vastness of space, leaving behind the vessel that had once been her prison. But the journey wasn't over. Now, the real challenge began. They had escaped, yes. But in the unforgiving expanse of space, there were no guarantees. Freedom was a hard-won prize, and Kayla knew they would need to fight every step of the way to hold on to it. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope.